Hey everyone, Scott here. I have a special announcement before we begin this episode. I'm doing a 5-part series on the Middle Ages, and I make the argument that the so-called Dark Ages really weren't that dark. No one thought the Earth was flat. Many things were invented like clocks, windmills, and even flying machines. Universities were built, philosophy spread, and even the bad stuff that we associate with the Middle Ages, like witch burnings, happened in the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment. The reason I'm doing this series is because I'm also releasing a book that I just finished on the same subject. It's called The Age of Illumination: Science, Technology, and Reason in the Middle Ages. It covers all the things I'm going to mention in this podcast series, but goes into way more detail. The book is now available on Amazon in ebook and paperback form. I'm running 2 special promotions for History Unplugged listeners to launch this book. First, I'm giving away free ebook copies for the first 10 people who leave a review for the History Unplugged podcast on iTunes. All you have to do is leave a review, then email me the screen name under which you left the review. You can email that to me at info@historyonthenet.com. Second, I'm discounting the ebook to only 99 cents during launch week, which is February 18th to the 22nd. After that, the ebook will still be only $2.99. You can find the book by going to Amazon and searching for The Age of Illumination and Scott Rank. So if you like this podcast, I think you'll really like the book. I get way into the details of the Middle Ages and try to make the story as interesting as possible. So please go check it out on Amazon. And if you like the book, please leave a review as well. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. There are a few times in history that are used as a scapegoat by so many different people with such different agendas. But of all different times in history, the Middle Ages manages to accomplish this, I would say, better than any other time period. For example, for someone who fashions him or herself as being scientifically minded, they'd probably think of the Middle Ages as the age of superstition, ignorance, and a time of powerful corrupt institutions like monarchies and the medieval church, and they were able to oppress the poor in any way they saw fit. This negative perception of the Middle Ages has been popular for at least 100 years, but more like 150 or 200 years. But interestingly enough, even modern-day religious people would vilify the Middle Ages. To many, it represented a perversion of the true faith, as once practiced in earlier centuries. In the case of Christianity, the simple faith had been subverted into an indecipherable system of pilgrimage and crusading and indulgences and penance that made a life of faith miserable due to fear of one false step, getting yourself casted into the pits of hell. The only winner in this game was the top level of the church, which had full coffers from selling remittances from earthly sin and endless manpower available for the next crusade, whether in the Middle East against Muslims or in Europe against Cathars in France. Well, the pushback against this view of the Middle Ages has come from a lot of different places, but probably the most unlikely is the Monty Python alumnus Terry Jones. He created and hosted the show Medieval Lives in an attempt to set the record straight. He said, "It was the medieval world that dragged us into the future, not the reactionary Renaissance. Humans didn't lack a sense of individuality or lack a last name before the Renaissance, nor did the Renaissance cause an explosion of scientific discovery and humanist insight. After all, plenty of people in the Middle Ages had a sense of individuality. You could read the general prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, or Dante. In fact, what Jones and other people argue is that it was the Renaissance that was a backward-looking movement that hailed the distant past. Petrarch wanted to return to the world of classical Latin and the Roman Empire and put to death the living Latin that he and his neighbors still spoke in churches and monasteries. Instead, he killed it altogether as a spoken language. So he was a reactionary who thought enlightenment only came from the past, while Dante and Chaucer wrote in a vernacular language that celebrated the individuality of ordinary men and women. But what happened is that Renaissance writers had to distort the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance and darkness. So Terry Jones is following the trail of scholars who've been making the same point for nearly a century. The scholarly understanding in the Middle Ages as a time of progress has shifted so radically that many dub the 1100s as the Renaissance of the 12th century. By this, they mean a period of many changes at the outset of the Middle Ages, including social, political, and economic transformations, and the explosion of philosophical and scientific understanding. Only through this growth in learning was the later Italian Renaissance in the 15th century, which concerned itself with literature and art instead of science, possible. This period saw what historian Charles Haskins notes as the rise of towns, the earliest bureaucratic states, and the culmination of Romanesque art and the beginnings of Gothic art. The 1100s also saw the emergence of vernacular literature, the recovery of Greek science with its Arabic editions, and the recovery of much Greek philosophy and the beginnings of the first European universities. It was Europe's first great age of civilization, when massive cathedrals rose, dwarfing the Roman buildings that remained unmatched in size for over a millennium, and outdoing them in their splendor with their mosaics, hangings, and sculpture. One story repeated ad nauseum of the reason of the Renaissance defeating medieval superstition is Christopher Columbus defying the conventional wisdom of the day that the earth was flat. He sailed west over the Atlantic, which many people thought meant falling into an infinite abyss. This mythic assertion was first stated in a book by Washington Irving in 1828 called A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. The book was a massive bestseller and the most popular biographical account of Columbus until the mid-20th century. Here's a snippet of the text when Columbus entered the courts of Ferdinand and Isabella, pleading his case to sail west in front of the College of Learned Men of the Church, seemed to have learned all of their knowledge of geography from the Old Testament. Such were the prejudices which Columbus had to encounter at the very outset of his conference, and which certainly relish more of the convent than the university. To his simplest proposition, the spherical form of the earth, were opposed figurative texts of Scripture. They observed that in the Psalms the heavens are said to be extended like a hide, that is, according to the commentators, the curtain or covering of a tent, which, among the ancient pastoral nations, was formed of the hides of animals, and that St. Paul, in his epistle to the Hebrews, compares the heavens to a tabernacle or tent, extended over the earth, which they thence inferred must be flat. Columbus, who was a devoutly religious man, found that he was in danger of being convicted not merely of error, but of heterodoxy. Others, more versed in science, admitted the globular form of the earth and the possibility of an opposite inhabitable hemisphere, but they brought up the chimera of the ancients and maintained that it would be impossible to arrive there in consequence of the insupportable heat of the torrid zone. Well, this story about Columbus making his case in front of these flat earthers is completely false. The story completely sprang out of Irving's imagination. That's because in the late 15th century, before Columbus sailed, no educated or influential member of medieval society believed the earth to be flat. The idea of a spherical earth had long been described in the classical tradition and was inherited by medieval academics. Eratosthenes of Cyrene managed to calculate the circumference of the earth with really good accuracy back in 200 BC, merely by measuring the length of a shadow at noon in Alexandria, noting the distance to Cyrene, where the sun was directly overhead, and using the sun's angle to extrapolate the total distance around the earth. But Irving wasn't interested in writing history. Despite traveling to Madrid and translating the source material on Columbus into English, Irving wanted to use American history to cast a tale of heroic patriotism for his readers. He transformed Columbus from a profit-seeking explorer with a shaky sense of geography into a thorough nationalist who was practically draped in an American flag with a bald eagle perched on his shoulder, sort of the proud, brave proto-American. He was writing for a public that was in search of a unifying figure to tie in the American states that had really different identities and a weak sense of connection with each other, and Irving was more than happy to provide that man in Columbus. Well, this story is one of many to show how our understanding of the Middle Ages is distorted. I had these same ideas of the Middle Ages, that it was a time of witch burnings, and if you had any heterodox thought, like that the earth wasn't flat, or you wanted to teach in any language except Latin, you'd be burned at the stake. It's been several years of learning about the Middle Ages where I've been able to piece by piece overcome this wrong understanding, and I'm sure I still have quite a bit of it. But I use this story to illustrate all the wrong ideas that are still floating out there about the Middle Ages. When I've told people on other podcasts that no one in the Middle Ages thought that the earth was flat, they're shocked. And in this podcast, in History Unplugged, I've devoted a lot of episodes to talk about counterintuitive facts about the Middle Ages. People didn't think the earth was flat. Medieval peasants were extremely handy. They had excellent knowledge on astronomy. They could memorize much more than you or I could. But still, questions keep coming back to me about the Middle Ages. Were people all dirty and ignorant and have horrible tooth decay? Did millions of people really die from witch burnings and witch hunts? How much money did the Catholic Church really make selling indulgences? Well, to get into this, I want to launch this series about counterintuitive facts on the Middle Ages. In this first episode, we're going to look at the collapse of the ancient world and the person of Charlemagne, because a lot hinges on his character. In the later episodes, we're going to go through the Middle Ages chronologically, but we're also going to look at aspects of medieval culture that seem surprising and counterintuitive. We'll look at the extraordinary power of medieval memory. We'll look at why peasants worked way less than you might think, perhaps way less than modern-day workers, and they weren't worked like slaves were in antebellum America. We'll look at the technological advancements of the Middle Ages. You had complex clocks that were so mechanically sophisticated, they were like mainframe computers. And we'll look at notable events like the Crusades, the rise of the Knights Templar, witch burnings in the Middle Ages, and the conquest of Constantinople, and put these events in the context of their times, and even though we might not agree with why people did the things that they did, at least understand the reasons for why they were doing so, and show that people in the Middle Ages weren't as different from you and I as you might think. The point being that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark. They weren't a period ruled by flat earthers intent on distinguishing the dying embers of learning left over from the fallout of the collapse of the classical world. Yes, there was a collapse of education and long-distance trade, especially in the early part of the Middle Ages from about 600 to 1000, but this wasn't due to the overall ignorance of people. A priest in 700 AD was equally intelligent to a Roman military officer of 500 years earlier. But when his civilization collapsed due to political and economic turmoil, there were simply more important matters at hand for the population to address than repairing the Colosseum, translating Greek texts into Latin, or painting mosaics. People of the early Middle Ages were like Soviet-trained nuclear physicists who still had the intelligence to split atoms, but after the Soviet Union fell, were forced to drive cabs in Russia to make ends meet. These early medieval Europeans still had the capacity for science and ceramics and Roman roads and aqueducts, but circumstances required that they put their hand on the plow and scratch out a meager sustenance living for their hungry family than do any of this elaborate civilization building. So the Middle Ages was a vibrant period in history. While there's some truth to the view that European civilization was downgraded after the fall of Rome, a lot of this perception is due to revisionist histories that use the past to make a point about today by using medieval figures as a stand-in for today's villains. But as we're going to see, it's actually the Middle Ages, more than any other time period, that define the identity of modern Europe and modern Western civilization. So in this series, we're going to join the chorus of scholars who see that the Middle Ages were essential to Western identity. They weren't a period to suffer through until the Renaissance returned Europe to its intellectual and cultural birthright. Rather, they were the times out of which Western identity was forged. And the modern world owes a lot to the Middle Ages because it was the linchpin between the chaotic world following the collapse of Rome and the world we inhabit today. The first thing we're going to look at is the collapse of the ancient world. To understand the context of the challenges that people in the Middle Ages have of dealing with the social issues of their time. Now, obviously, the Roman world cast a long shadow over the Middle Ages. That's even true up to the 20th century. In Eastern Europe, from Serbia to Bulgaria and the Russian Empire, from the 9th century up to 1946, monarchs were known as czars. In Germany, from the time of the earliest independent kings until the 19th century, the ruling monarch was called the Kaiser. So these are a few examples of the long-lived legacy of ancient Rome for both Tsar and Kaiser, since they're derivative of the title Caesar. The name Caesar, Caesar, is even popular in Turkey, a Muslim nation whose history wasn't parked in a close orbit of the Western world until more recently. So Rome and Caesar were so powerful and influential that centuries after the empire's demise, leaders sought to revive its glory and claim its legacy. This is particularly true of the Middle Ages, a time when the former territories of the Roman Empire lost their protection and supportive infrastructure, as well as their link to the knowledge and wisdom